Hello and welcome to the first demo from the Variables, Constants and Arguments in Studio course. In this demo, we'll learn the different ways of creating variables in UiPath Studio and using them to pass information between activities. Let's begin with a quick definition. Variables are storage locations that can hold multiple values of the same data type. We can think of variables as a box containing information that we can access. We can always open this box to check what's inside or put something else inside of it. For example, in a retail store, variables can be used to track the inventory levels of different products. A variable can be used to store the current number of a specific product in stock. As the product is sold, the new variable's value is updated to reflect the new inventory level. To accurately describe the usage of variables throughout the project, we must provide meaningful names to variables. Providing meaningful names is as good as labeling the box based on its content for easy identification. On this note, let's learn all of the ways of creating variables in UiPath Studio. Let's build a simple workflow to demonstrate the power of variables. The process asks for an input from the user and saves the answer to a string variable. Then it assigns a value to another string variable and logs a message with the two values. We already have a new Windows process where we added a new sequence creating variables and added an annotation. Since RPA projects can get quite complex and are often collaborative, it's good practice to give descriptive names to activities and add annotations. Great, let's add an input dialog activity. This activity displays a dialog box that prompts the user with a label message and an input field. Once the user provides the information, it saves the input to a variable. We'll update the display name to input user details and add an annotation. Let's set the dialog title to User Details. Now let's specify the information we want to obtain from the user in the Input Label field. Next, the input type is a drop-down list of text box and multiple choice. Let's select the input type as text box. This is where we'll specify the variable for which we want to save the value entered by the user. But to do this, we need to create a variable first. Let's check out the main ways to create a new variable in UiPath Studio. From the Variables panel by adding a new line. From the Activity Properties panel by pressing Ctrl+K in an input field that accepts variables. From the body of an activity by pressing Ctrl+K in an input field that can accept a variable name. Or by right-clicking in the input field and selecting the Create Variable option. From the Data Manager panel by clicking New Variable. And by right-clicking the activity and select Create Variable. This works in a scope, meaning within a sequence type activity. Let's use the Variables panel to create a new type of string variable called user name. First, let's enter the name of the variable. Best practices recommend using Pascal case and providing descriptive and meaningful variable names. Next, let's choose the type. We can select one of the types shown in the drop-down menu. But we can also click Browse and select a .NET type from the displayed window, for example, dictionary. In our case, we have a string variable, so we'll click Cancel and leave it as it is. The Scope field determines the containers in which the variable is available. If there are two variables with the same name, the variable defined in the most inner scope tops the priority list. However, keep in mind that the naming best practices of variables recommends not to have the same variable name. The default value sets an initial value for the variable when the workflow is started. Let's add our variable in the Value Entered field of the Input User Details Input Dialog activity. Now we want to print the value entered by the user. Several activities enable us to do that in different ways. Message box, write line, or log message. Let's use a log message. Rename it and add an annotation. Set the log level to info and enter the username variable in the message field. This activity writes the specified diagnostic message at the selected level, in this case, info. The messages are displayed in the output panel and also stored in the log fields for future use. Let's save and run the file in debug mode. We'll enter a value in the input dialog. So far so good. Now let's check the output panel. Great, we can see the value we've entered in the output panel. Next, we'll have a look at using the Ctrl+K method to create variables, using the assign activity, how variable scopes work, and concatenating strings. For this demonstration, let's create a new sequence inside of our sequence and call it assign sequence. Now, let's add an assign activity to the new sequence. Rename it to assign username status and add an annotation. The assign activity allocates any value we set to a variable or argument. All we need to do is to enter the variable in the to field and the value or expression in the value field. But before we can assign a value, we need to create the variable. Let's click the to field of the assign activity and press Ctrl+K. Let's name the variable status and press enter. The variable appears in the variables and data manager panels. Next, we'll give a value to this variable using the assign activity. For this example, let's enter is logged in the value input field. An assign activity always works from right to left. When we create a variable using this method, the default data type is string. And the scope is set to the container which includes it, in our case, assign sequence. An interesting fact about the Ctrl+K method is that it will declare a variable of the type required in the to field. For instance, if the required data type in the field is UI element, then that's the data type that it will assign to the newly created variable. If not, the data type is a string, as in our case. Next, we can change the message from the log message activity to a concatenation of the strings in the two variables. The concatenation is obtained by using the VB.NET operators plus or ampersand. But it looks like we've run into some trouble. The scope of the variable status is set to the assign sequence, which means that the variable isn't declared outside of this sequence. To use it, we need to change the scope of the variable from assign sequence to creating variable sequence. Note that the compilation error has disappeared. Great! Now that we've demonstrated how scopes work, let's remove the unnecessary assign sequence. Let's save and run the file in debug mode again and check the message in the output panel. And everything looks good. Alright, for the final stretch, let's see the method of right-clicking in an input field and selecting the Create Variable option. For demo purposes, let's add another assign activity. Let's right-click it and select the Create Variable option. This method is an alternate for the shortcut key Ctrl+K method. This creates a new variable in the Variables panel. And we're familiar with this, so let's enter the variable name, user address, and leave the type to string and the scope to creating variable sequence. Add this newly created variable in the to field, and that's it. Keeping best practices in mind, we'll delete the variable and the assign activity that aren't needed, and we're good to go. But wait, let's check what happens if we rename the variable which is in use in our workflow. Let's rename the variable username to user address. Renaming a variable in the variable panel automatically updates all occurrences in the current file. We see the renamed variable appears in the value entered field, in the message field, and in the data manager panel. Awesome! Let's change this back to the original variable name. This first demo taught us all of the ways to create a variable in UiPath Studio, from the Variables panel, from the Data Manager panel, by selecting Create Variable from the body of an activity, by clicking Ctrl+K in the field of the activity. In addition, we've seen how easily variables can be used and managed in a workflow if we follow best practices. If you're building along, we'd encourage you to try it on your own. Create a new variable, email address, from the Data Manager panel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.